I'm Scott Alexander, and in this video I'll be continuing my discussion of Maimonides' 26 Aristotelian Propositions located in his introduction to Volume 2 of the Guide of the Perplexed. In this video I'll be dealing with what I call his 5 propositions of form and matter. I'll briefly introduce the whole concept of form and matter and go through each of its 5 propositions. The propositions are about composites in general, that's Proposition 21, matter and form, Proposition 22, potentiality versus possibility, Proposition 23, the material subject, Proposition 24, and the proximate mover, Proposition 25. The general importance of the concept of form and matter for Maimonides was the realization that all things are composites, as he said in his Proposition 21, which was about composition. Proposition 21. Every composition of 2 elements necessarily has that composition as cause of its present existence. Its existence is not necessitated with respect to itself. Its existence depends upon its parts and their composition. Now, the first seemingly trivial point to be made is that composites always consist of more than one component. These components must exist prior to the existence of the composite, since that's what the composite is made of. The components exist prior in time, and so it follows that the composite being had a beginning. Whatever caused the composite to come together must have preceded it both in nature and in time. Those prior causes cannot be part of an endless chain. They must commence with an actual first cause. But all beginnings terminate in their final end, which is the composite thing manifest before us. Maimonides will use this proposition in the next chapter by leaping to its result. He says that inasmuch as the composite being, quote, depends upon its parts and their conjunction, the converse must follow, that there must be a necessary existence, that is to say God, who, quote, does not include any plurality whatsoever, by which he means God has no plurality of parts. It follows that God's absolute existence is causeless because God does not have components. God's causelessness is important since there must be an uncaused cause at the beginning to avoid infinite regress. Maimonides thinks that this proposition is true because anything that is composite was brought into existence. The consequence is that there must ultimately be something non-composite which brings all composites into existence. And so in the next proposition, we'll learn about what the basic components of any composition are. And we will learn that they are matter and form. Proposition 22. Material objects are always composed of at least 2 elements and are subject to accidents. The 2 elements constituting it are its matter and its form. The accidents that must accompany it are quantity, position, and geometrical form, in other words, its shape. Now, why does Maimonides think this is true? When the ancients observed the changes and alterations in what they took to be the basic elements themselves, they concluded that there must be 2 components, which will be called matter and form. And that's because the irreducible elements seemed to change into one another. Thus, in the classic example, using the 4 ancient elements, earth, air, fire, and water, where elemental water subjected to heat becomes elemental air, what we would call water vapor, and when subjected to cold, freezes solid, joining the elemental earth, something must support these transitions of elements, and this something is what they call matter. Here's another explanation that they gave. Everything is subject to division and cohesion. But because division and cohesion are opposite states, the division can't be in the cohesion and the cohesion can't be in the division. Some underlying matter must underpin these changes, these divisions, these combinations. It's important to recognize that with respect to this matter, we can't touch it and we can't see it. And that's why Aristotle called it intelligible matter. He meant that we know it, but we don't see it. Its existence is conceptual, but nonetheless real, although its reality is a sort of negative reality. Matter's relationship to form is ultimately the primal relationship of not being to being. The proposition concludes by saying that once it has achieved being, the composite must always have three accidents, at least. Quantity, in the sense of measurable dimensionality and solidity. Shape, which is different from quantity, since the same quantity can be manifested by different shapes. And position, which is the relationship of the parts of the being to each other. No composite being exists without the accidents of quantity, shape, and position. The next proposition is Proposition 23, which is about the distinction between potentiality and possibility. It's short, but it's very difficult. It reads, quote, anything that exists potentially and has any possibility attached to it may at some time not exist as an actuality. Maimonides remarked on the difficulty of this proposition in a written reply to his translator, Rabbi Shmuel ibn Tibbon, quote, to grasp the distinction between potentiality and possibility requires great subtlety, and is a matter of utmost difficulty even to trained philosophers. A fair reading of the letter to his translator finds this subtle distinction he referred to resides in the difference between the subject and the object of the potentiality. Subject-object relations is an important but difficult topic that students of philosophy and theology must deal with at one point or another. Maimonides will use this tool in the next several propositions, so we do have to understand how it works. The subjects are the actors, the agents of change. The objects are the passive recipients of change. Subjects act upon objects, which receive the action of their subjects. When we apply this rule and break down Proposition 23, we find that it yields three principles. The first is about potentiality. That principle is that anything or characteristic must exist at some point in a state of potentiality with respect to its subject. Let me explain. Take a piece of iron. A piece of iron is potentially a sword, or in the case of a seed is potentially a tree. The subjects in these cases are the iron and the seed, while the sword and the tree are the objects to be actualized, to be realized. The subject iron has a potential existence where it could be made into something else. For example, a knife, a fork, a sword, etc. Potentiality always looks to the future, striving to be realized when it will no longer be potential in the subject, but will be actualized as a real existing object. But while the sword is still potential, its existence in the subject iron is only embryonic. But though the sword has not yet been made by the swordsmith, we should yet realize that its potential is a real potential. It's a real existence. The actualization of this potential in the subject is what produces the object, the actual sword. The difference I'm highlighting here is that the sword is the possible object. So let's turn to that sword when it is that possibility, when it is that object, and find out whether it's as real as the potentialities are. We will see that the possibilities are not so real. And so the second principle about Proposition 23 is about that possibility in the object. That principle is that any potentiality within an existing thing has possible existence as the object to be actualized. Thus, the sword object can possibly come from the iron subject. The meaning of this possibility is that the sword might or might not be actualized as an object. Where is this possibility located? The possibility for the actual existence of the sword exists only in the mind of the swordsmith. Thus, the swordsmith imagines the possible sword that could be crafted from the subject iron. It follows that the distinction between the possible and the potential is that the possible is a mental determination or a choice. The consequence is that the possible object has no reality itself until it is brought to reality by the swordsmith. As a mere possibility, it has no reality. By contrast, the potential sword as a potential has a real, though unactualized, embryonic existence and is not just the mere possibility of existence. This potential sword is a real possibility existing in the subject iron. But the merely possible object, the sword, will not be real until it's brought forth from that iron. Thus, the sword could just as well have been a fork rather than a sword, for neither is impossible to the mind of the craftsman. Nothing compels the craftsman to choose one over the other. A possible future fork, like the possible future sword, is only one of a range of possibilities. The third rule of potentiality and possibility, emerging from Proposition 23, is that everything that is potentially something else will not actually be that something else at some time. What this means is that potentialities persist, but that possibilities will at some point not persist. Thus, both the sword and the fork are always potentially in the subject iron, but if it's made into a sword, the possible fork will not exist. Maimonides writes about this in his letter to his translator, quote, "For a given piece of iron cannot be called potentially a sword unless it is not a sword at some time." Okay, so what are the consequences of this doctrine? As we've just seen, though they are real, potentialities might or might not attain actualized existence. Maimonides will use this point in the next chapter to show that if God possessed any such potentiality, it is possible that this potentiality might not come to be. But the idea is absurd, since God's total absolute existence is necessary. Not only that, but the realization of any potentiality always depends upon an external cause. But when the action of such a cause ceases and comes to a halt, the potential would be without actual existence, which again, with respect to God, would be absurd. The consequence is that God possesses no potentiality. The next proposition is about the material subject, which is the end result of any causal chain. It is the thing that we see. It's what was brought about by the change agent that we discussed in the last video. The reason why this end result is called a subject is because it has dynamic potential to be an actor, to be an agent of change. That leads us to the topic of the nature of this material subject, which is expressed by Rambam's Proposition 24, which reads, quote, anything that is potentially something is certainly a material subject. In Hebrew, a Bal Chomer. Matter is always subject to possibility. Maimonides explained why matter is always subject to possibility, to dependency, writing to his translator where he said, quote, "Possibility and potentiality are mutually dependent, a unified continuity, and this possibility never departs from matter or anything generated from it." When Maimonides mentions anything generated from matter, he's talking about the material subject. Material subjects are things that have a potential to be something else. They consist of the matter and forms that could be realized in a particular type of matter, like the potentiality of the subject iron to become a sword or a fork. But the sword or fork, once realized, also possesses a potential to be something else. And this takes place at every stage of the causal chain. Once a particular possibility has been realized, the object becomes the new subject. This material subject, which is manifest before us, is the last step in all causal chains. But this last step in the causal chain possesses inner dynamism. It possesses possibilities. But the first cause, God, could not be subject to any such possibilities, and that's because possibilities must be brought forth by an agent, but no agent brings forth God. Therefore, God is not a material subject. At the end of the proposition, Maimonides asks us to consider that matter can never exist independently. It must always be joined to form. Yet matter is always striving to realize another potential connection to some new form. That's why Maimonides compares matter to the married harlot of Proverbs chapter 7. Matter is like a married harlot since it's always looking to join up with a new form. Matter usually exists in a more or less stable relationship with its form, married to it, so to speak, but it has a promiscuous nature. Maimonides, following this thought out, explains that potentialities always come with privations. The reason that potentialities come with privations is that you cannot potentially have something unless you lack it. Maimonides wrote, quote, "The true nature of matter is such that it never ceases to be associated with privation. It's for this reason that matter does not retain permanently any single form, but is always taking off one form and putting on another." Now that we've come to the material object and the end of the causal chain, we must know that there was a prior material subject that changed to adopt this new form. What was it that caused that last change? The question leads us to the last mover, which we'll call the proximate mover, and it is the one closest to us, the last of the change agents, which is the subject of the next proposition, Proposition 25. The proximate mover. Each compound substance consists of matter and form, but there must be an agent, that is to say, a mover, that will move the material substrate until it is prepared to accept the form. This immediate motor, in other words, the proximate mover, prepares the matter of this substance. The necessity arises of investigating into the properties of motion, the moving agent, and the thing moved, which Aristotle clarified, writing, "Matter does not move itself." This is the important proposition which arouses our quest for the existence of the prime mover. The purpose of this proposition is to spell out the underlying meditation for Maimonides' proof of God's existence. Starting from the recognition that all things are composites of matter and form, there must be a third cause which prepares that matter to accept a new form. We view this third cause as a mover, as the proximate mover. It's the last in any chain of causes leading to the final physical substance manifest before us. This meditation on motion reminds us of why we need this proximate mover. For matter cannot prepare itself to accept a potential form. And that's because matter has no internal principle of self-preparation or movement. The duality of form and matter suffices to explain the existence of the physical substance, but does not explain its generation. And that's why we must find the third principle, external to the prior substance, that causes the preparation of its matter to accept a new form, which will result in the future generation of things. We identify that third principle as the proximate mover, but this proximate mover owes its own motion to the great chain of motion, which must commence with the heavens motion engendered by the prime mover. Thus, it comes out that God is the sufficient reason for all motion in our universe. Is there a problem with this proposition? Not at all. The commentators unusually unite in praise of this proposition. Here are some of their positive reviews. The modern commentator, Rabbi Dr. Yehuda Evan Shmuel, said of it that, still remaining within the limits of natural philosophy, we ascend to the philosophy of the divine. The 13th century commentator, Rabbi Hillel ben Shmuel of Verona, wrote, "This speculation on the existence of the proximate mover forces meditation on the prime mover and validates his existence. It is the foundation and key to this entire section of the Guide of the Perplexed." The 15th century Rabbi Shem Tov noted how the Aristotelian notion transcends itself, saying, "Aristotle would not have known or arrived at intelligible substance but through this idea of the beginnings of tangible substance." In the next video in this series, I'll talk about Aristotelian eternalism, which is the subject of the last proposition, Proposition 26. It'll be the beginning of the great debate between Athens and Jerusalem. In that debate, Maimonides shows why he thinks that the doctrine of creationism is superior to Aristotle's doctrine of eternalism to account for the origin of the universe. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. Thank you very much for listening. You may contact me at scottalexander@rcn.com with comments, questions, and criticism. Please click on the description panel for this talk on YouTube to see links to any documents referred to in this video. Please visit my website, Maimonides-guide.com, to see my commentary essays on each chapter of Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, currently completed through the entire first volume of the guide, and it now includes my commentary on the introduction to the second volume. If you found anything in these lectures obscure, please refer to that essay, which is much more detailed than these videos. On my website, you should also be able to find associated essays I've written, podcasts, videos, and important links. Of course, please like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe, and hit the YouTube notification bell. Thank you.